Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Chen, and along with the other members of the LACBA President's Advisory Committee on Women in the Legal Profession Subcommittee on Gender Bias and Civility, I am proud and excited to be bringing you another installment of our 2021 Recorded Oral History Series. The purpose of the Oral History Series is to share the stories of women attorneys who have experienced or witnessed gender bias and instances of incivility, and who have successfully addressed or navigated around such issues in their own lives. In addition to discussing their own paths, they will offer their insights on what progress, if any, they think the profession has made and what further steps the legal field should take to combat gender inequity and ensure equal opportunities and the full participation of women. As for my own personal background, I am a Chinese American from a multi-generational immigrant family who is the first lawyer in her family. I served in the Department of Justice for over 15 years, both in the civil and criminal divisions in the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, California, until recently. As someone who specialized in racketeering, gang, drug cartel, and money laundering cases, I often led investigative teams of up to 100 law enforcement officers. I was the only woman in the room. Indeed, in 2019, I became the first female chief in office history of the section. Now at a big law firm as a partner, I still see too few women, 20%, and women of AAPI descent, less than 2%, who have made it to partnership. I am proud to be part of this series because I think it is crucial to amplify the stories of phenomenal women who have made their mark on the world and to share their stories of triumphs and lessons learned. However, more can and should be done, and it is incumbent on all of us to do our part in ensuring that progress in the legal profession in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion continues. Today, I'm especially honored to be talking with two women who have dedicated their lives to fighting against systemic racism and advocating for the civil rights of the AAPI communities and other underrepresented people. They have been on the front lines over the last year and a half, helping to combat the anti-Asian hate surge during the pandemic. Manju Kangarni is a racial justice attorney and civil rights activist who has worked on behalf of communities of color for over 20 years. Currently, she is the executive director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, AP3Con, a coalition of more than 40 community-based organizations serving the 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in LA County. She is also a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, an aggregator of COVID-19 related hate incidents against members of the AAPI community nationwide, and is a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. In addition to countless other speaking, media engagements, and publications, she testified before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties in March 2021 about the alarming rise of Asian hate incidents during the pandemic. Manju previously headed the South Asian Network, an organization dedicated to advancing the health, empowerment, and solidarity of persons of South Asian origin in Southern California, served as a senior staff attorney at the National Health Law Program, and as a lawyer in the Office of the Civil Rights Monitor in Los Angeles. Amongst many of the awards and accolades she has received, Manju received the White House Champions of Change Award in 2014 from President Obama, the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year for her work with Stop AAPI Hate, and the 2021 SABA North America Cornerstone Award. She was named by the American Planning Association as one of 12 AAPI leaders who have shaped our cities. In addition, City Attorney Mike Fuhr recently announced his appointment of Manju to the City Ethics Commission for a 5-year term effective next month. Manju received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and a certificate in Women's Studies from Duke University and a Juris Doctor degree from Boston University School of Law. After graduating from college, she worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Attorney General's office in her hometown of Montgomery, Alabama. While in law school, Manju clerked at the American Civil Liberties Union, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, California. Connie Chung similarly has had an extensive career in fighting for the rights of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities and other underserved communities. Currently, she is the Chief Executive Officer of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the nation's largest legal and civil rights organization for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Prior to joining Advancing Justice LA in August of 2020, Connie served as the Executive Director of the Korean American Family Services, KFAM, for 11 years. Under Connie's leadership, KFAM nearly quadrupled its budget and staff with culturally and linguistically responsive services to immigrant families, particularly those struggling with mental health, domestic and family violence, and acculturation stresses. Prior to joining KFAM, Connie was a public interest lawyer for 7 years. She worked at the Housing Rights Center in Los Angeles and the American Civil Liberties Union in Chicago. Connie co-founded the AAPI Human Trafficking Task Force of Los Angeles County and previously served as the Vice Chair of Planning with A3PCon and the co-chair of A3PCon's Mental Health Subcommittee, the co-chair and steering committee member of the California Culturally Responsive Domestic Violence Network, which consists of culturally specific domestic violence organizations across the state working to improve services for the most vulnerable communities in California, and also served with the AAPI Domestic Violence Task Force of Los Angeles County. In addition to the many speaking engagements she has participated in, Connie has testified on several occasions before the California State Assembly on domestic violence to advocate for the needs of immigrants, APIs, and other vulnerable populations in the state. In 2016, she was appointed by California State President pro tempore Kevin De Leon to the Domestic Violence Advisory Council. She has been honored by the Asian Pacific Women's Center as well as the Asian American Drug Abuse Program. And in 2017, Connie was named a 40 under 40 emerging civic leader. She currently serves as a member of Bank of America's National Community Advisory Council. Connie received her Bachelor of Arts degree in Spanish and International Relations from USC and her Juris Doctor degree from Georgetown University Law Center. Welcome both ladies. I am so grateful for both of you to spend time with us today. Obviously, from the introductions that I just gave, both of you have had wildly impactful, remarkable public interest and civil rights lawyer and activist careers for well over the last 2 decades. I am struck in particular by the many parallels in both of your lives and careers. In addition to often speaking together about the rise in anti-Asian hate since the start of the pandemic, both of you have physician mothers. Both of you knew that you wanted to pursue public interest law going into law school. And both of you also moved away from traditional lawyer roles to working in executive director roles at community-based social organizations. So I want to start off first by talking about the choice to pursue law and go to law school, something that you, Manju, have previously talked about. Given that both of you come from families of doctors, Manju, both of your parents were doctors, I believe, and Connie, I think your mother was also a doctor. I'm curious whether there were any familial expectations and pressures for either of you growing up to go into the medical profession instead.
Well, I can start, and thank you, Carol, for this very kind and generous introduction. And really, it's just an honor to be part of this project and to be here with Connie, who, as you pointed out, has been in multiple leadership roles at my organization, APCON, in terms of the mental health work, domestic violence, and human trafficking. So in terms of my own family expectations, there were many. And certainly I helped to contribute to some of those. As early as age 5, telling everyone that I wanted to be a doctor like my parents. So it's no surprise that they were disappointed in college when I said that really I wanted to shift gears, and I had really become interested in the law and political science for some time, starting off at least in high school, if not before. So, at the time, and I don't know if this is true for Connie, but in the South Asian American community, there really weren't a lot of physicians here in the US, lawyers in the United States. And that's, due in large part to the fact of really the Immigration Act of 1965, which brought my family and so many families like mine to the United States. And so the only pathways really for those folks were in medicine, science, and engineering. And those are definitely careers in India and South Asia that are really heralded, less so for the law or what's seen as sort of the arts or humanities. So it wasn't even just my immediate family that was disappointed. It was actually my whole extended family. So much so that when I went back to India for trips afterwards, they were like, oh, like what happened? Like it was almost as if I had suffered some traumatic injury that led me to the law instead of medicine. So yes, there were absolutely family expectations. And so at least at that time, it was challenging to face up to those and then to really rebuff them and choose a different path.
Yeah, and Carol, I too am so grateful to you and the LA County Bar Association for inviting me to join this panel. Actually, both my parents were physicians as well. So Manju and I have that in common too. In my family, I think my parents had hoped that me or one of my siblings would become a doctor, but they weren't, we didn't get too much pressure about it. And I have to say they were pretty open-minded. I did consider going pre-med in college for about a hot second, and then realized that was definitely not for me. I think when I decided to pursue law, that wasn't too surprising to my family. They used to joke around when I was little that I was going to be a lawyer because I argued so much with my parents. I think what was harder was probably the decision to go into public interest law. I went into law school knowing full well I would never work at a firm. And I think the legal field is generally considered an acceptable or a good career for Korean Americans. But I think part of that is because they assume that you're going to be financially successful with it, like you would as a doctor. And knowing that I would not really make all that much money as a public interest attorney, I think that was a little bit harder for my family to swallow. That, I think I couldn't buy like the nice things for my parents the way some of their other colleagues would get from their kids. But I have to say, my family was still very open-minded. They never actually explicitly said it was a problem. They never discouraged me from doing it. And they were always quite open-minded. But I did know just that cultural kind of pressure was there.
Thank you both for that perspective. And Connie, I'm sorry, I missed that fact that your dad was also a physician. So focusing on the fact that both of you have mothers who are physicians, clearly neither of you followed in her footsteps. But nevertheless, do you think that having a strong female role model affected your view of yourself and the world and your career path?
Yeah, I mean, for me, absolutely. When my mom shares that she came to America and she actually convinced my father to come to America and immigrate here because she felt that as a woman in Korea, she would not have the same opportunities as she could have here. And she was born in North Korea during the Korean War and fled to South Korea. So she grew up in a refugee family. So did my father, in a war-torn country that at that time was, considered a third world country, and had no money. And she was only able to get to law school because she was the top of her class from kindergarten through 12th grade, and was given a scholarship. And when she got to when she got to medical school, excuse me, there were over 150 students, I believe, and there were less than 5 women in her class. So she grew up in a culture that was very patriarchal, where women did not have the same opportunities, and she felt that America was where she needed to be in order to thrive. And although my mother I've never heard her refer to herself as a feminist, it was very clear that those were the kinds of values that she was sharing. And she was the one who made the family decision to come, and my father supported that and then brought the rest of her relatives. So my mother is a very important role model to me. She was always working. When I was first born, she was actually in the US Army. So was my father, but they were actually stationed in separate places. So after she'd given birth to me, 2 weeks later, she convinced her superior to let her go back into basic training so she could join my father at the military base. And so she is somebody who is, she's cut from a different cloth, and she's always been a very high performing professional woman. And so I learned that from her.
It's so interesting how many parallels Connie and I have with one another. I would say, my mother's trajectory was similar in that, she grew up in a city the size of LA, Pune, which is near Mumbai, and was one of the top students, starting from 4th grade in the entire city. So having those high expectations on herself and excelling, I think, oftentimes put her in a different place as maybe other family members, and certainly helped to guide her decision to come to the US. One thing I think I saw very early on was that my parents were equals in a way that I didn't see with many friends of mine, because they were both working, they were both professional. And in fact, they talk shop at the dinner table, right? So talking about what procedure was the most effective, talking about different conditions that their patients had, the challenges. So just seeing that, I think, made me realize what women could do, that the opportunities were, at least just in our own family, boundless, and that I also wanted that for myself, and that I wanted to be an equal partner in a marriage, and that's what I sought out for myself. My mother actually also spent some of her career in the armed services. She was an Air Force doctor on a military base. And I think, what's interesting about that too is the opportunities that provided. It was actually just on the heels of her experience, actually, racial discrimination at a hospital and not being hired, but she was able to get a job as a military doctor. One thing I wanted to say too, is, I wanted to give my dad some credit as well. He actually was pretty vocal as a father of 3 daughters, of being a feminist. And I don't know if he was pushed into that or if he sought it naturally, but he certainly encouraged my sisters and I, to take advantage of every opportunity, saying, we shouldn't be on the sidelines of anything. And really sort of carpe diem in terms of our lives. The one last thing too I wanted to point out was that Connie and I participated in a project on domestic violence prevention in the AAPI community. And one of the findings of our research last year was that gender equity played such a key role in having women role models for women who did not experience essentially family violence, and were able to be essentially equal partners in their marriage, but also take a leading role in the family. So I want to just point out that I think both of our experiences probably speak to that as well.
I really appreciate both of you, and the parallels are uncanny, right? You've already pointed out additional ones that I didn't know about. So Manju, I appreciate you giving a shout out to your dad, because I do think that as we talk further along today, hopefully one of the lessons is it's not just on women, but also on men and everybody to be able to pitch in, right, and improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the legal profession, hopefully in the broader world. I will also point out that the apple clearly didn't fall far from the tree for both of you, because in addition to being amazing, resilient, accomplished women, it is clear that both of your mothers were as well. And so that was something that shaped you growing up. Manju, you already sort of alluded to this, but I want to expand upon this. Both of you have previously spoken about events and people in your personal lives which impacted your decision to go to law school and pursue law. And Connie, you had talked about public interest in law, and I want to talk a little bit further about that. But first, the decision to go to law school. Manju, you had already referenced, but if you could talk a little bit further about how your mother's racial discrimination lawsuit against a hospital with whom she had applied for a job and didn't get, and it was interesting to me that what was said to her was so overt, because I'm not sure that would normally happen. But if you can talk a little bit about that. And Connie, you had previously talked about having heard about the great work of the current nominee for Deputy Secretary of Labor, Julie Su, on behalf of Tide Sweatshop workers while she was at what was then called the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. And obviously now it's the organization you lead. If both of you could speak a little bit about both of those, as well as any other events or people in your lives that also shaped your desire to pursue law and get into and go to law school.
Sure. So when I was about, I would say 9 or 10, my mother applied for a position at a hospital, and essentially the interview committee was made up of all white men, and they had no trouble saying to her, essentially, you foreigners come here and take our jobs. They said that very overtly, as you pointed out, Carol, and denied her a position. And so it was after that my mother and father decided to pursue a lawsuit against the hospital, and they were able to retain an attorney who is actually on the board of directors of the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery. And not only were they able to win, but it actually was a class action lawsuit that changed the way that residency programs in Alabama functioned. Because up to that point, there was actually overt discrimination within that program as well. And of course, leading to then doctors who are hired by various hospitals in the state, where doctors from Europe were readily hired and included in the residency programs, but doctors from other parts of the world, essentially brown and Black doctors and AAPI doctors were not. And so it was, in fact, interesting that really set me in motion in terms of wanting to pursue the law. So it was many times during my college decision-making process that I said to my parents, it's actually kind of your fault that I wanted to go into the law, because you pursued this lawsuit. I could see that the law actually had positive impacts on people's lives, and specifically civil rights. And of course, you know, growing up in Montgomery, it was very clear the impact of what the civil rights movement meant on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in my community and across the state and region. So yes, it had absolute impacts, and I think very much shaped my decision to pursue civil rights law and public interest more broadly.
Manju, that's such a great story. I haven't heard that story about your mom before, so I'm glad to hear it today. Yeah, and for me, you know, I remember being in college. I think I was a third or fourth year college student at USC. And on the front page of the LA Times was this huge article about a sweatshop in El Monte, Los Angeles, where 72 Thai immigrants had been working in slave-like conditions. They had been behind barbed wire, forced to work, you know, I think up to 16 hours a day, were not allowed to leave this compound, and they were making labels for clothing manufacturers and making next to nothing. And in some cases, they had been in these places in this compound for years. And there was an organization called Asian Pacific American Legal Center that was helping these sweatshop workers, working to change the conditions for in sweatshops, and then working to change the laws for folks who had been trafficked into this country. And this was the first case of modern day slavery in America. And you know, I learned that Julie Su was a litigation attorney. There was another attorney who was the founder of that organization named Stuart Quo. And in reading about this, and this was in the LA Times, not just once, but the articles were day in and day out. And it was the first time I had ever heard of public interest attorneys who were API. The only attorneys I had heard of were folks who worked in firms before that, and not too many. In my family, most folks were either doctors, nurses, accountants, or small business owners. They owned liquor stores and grocery stores. And seeing that and seeing what these APALC attorneys were doing was what opened the door to me to think maybe I really should apply for law school, because I had known I was interested in social justice. I thought maybe that would be international human rights, maybe it would be domestic civil rights, but I couldn't really imagine being an API civil rights attorney until I actually saw some role models like that. And I think that had a very profound impact on the trajectory of where I went forward.
So Connie, I will tell you that I also had read about Julie Su's great work, and I think I was probably in college as well. And it actually led me to do some research at Asian American Legal Center because I wanted to know these people and all the great work they were doing. And then Manju, your mom's racial discrimination lawsuit obviously didn't just have impact for her, but as you pointed out, sort of wider impact. So those are really great stories, and I'm so glad that the viewers get to hear about those stories. So we talked a little bit about this, especially Connie, you had said that your family initially thought, well, if she's going to go into law, at least she's going to be financially secure. And it turns out you devoted your life to public interest law. And Manju, you had talked a little bit about how your family originally wanted you to go into the medical profession because that was a lot of your members of your family were like that. Were there any other factors or people who, when they heard that either of you wanted to go into public interest law, they thought they were sort of against it? And I'm assuming now your family is wildly proud of both of you and the work that you do day in, day out. But was it a struggle to get people, particularly in your family, to see sort of what great work you were doing, even if it was at a great cost and sacrifice to yourself, not just financially, but presumably also, emotionally draining work that both of you do?
Yeah, I'll go first. You know, I will say that, excuse me, my immediate family was always very supportive towards me. When I said that I was going to go into public interest law, they were fine with that. And my mom would proudly tell people, Connie wants to serve other people. She's doing it because she wants to help others. I think it was a little bit harder with more extended relatives and the larger, social circles and spheres that my family was in. Particularly because I decided to work at the ACLU, and it is a very progressive organization. And for some of the more conservative Korean Americans in my family or in our church or extended social spheres, that was a little bit tough for them to swallow, that I was advocating for the rights of the LGBTQ community, that I was really focusing more on the needs of Blacks for police misconduct cases. And I think for some of our community members, they understand missionary work, so they like the idea of serving others in need. But the kind of progressive values that we were promoting at ACLU was a little bit harder for some folks. And so that was, I think, a little challenging at first, knowing that some of my family members, some of our close friends didn't really love what I was doing. They didn't really like the ACLU and those kind of progressive values. And it took a few years before I think that became sort of easier and it developed a little bit more of a shell and more of a thick skin to understand it is what it is. But that is, for me, an important value system, and I just need to own that.
I can say in my experience, I mean, first off, I did get a lot of support from my immediate family and was lucky that, even when I was in my mid to late 20s, just driving in the car one day, my mom said, I think you made the right decision pursuing the law. And so she was able to overcome that. Perhaps it also had to do with the fact that my youngest sister got into med school around the same time. So the burden was lifted from me specifically. But what I would say too, like Connie, is my extended family was really never sure what public interest law was, and especially if it didn't involve trial work. And so not being a litigator really confounded them. Like, if you're not in court, what is it that you're doing exactly? Because most lawyers in India, that's where they spend all of their days, is litigating. But what they weren't surprised about, I think, ultimately, is what I chose to pursue in terms of progressive values, because for, I think, my entire sort of childhood and teenage years, whether it was my grandparents or aunts and uncles would say, like, oh gosh, that's Manju being Manju again. When it came to different, challenges I pushed around gender issues, around race, in politics, when there were political discussions in our family. And so yes, they were not always happy about my position, but they ultimately came to understand it. And so I think my career decisions essentially mimicked my personality, or what I would say is sort of my authentic self growing up all those years.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. Both of you have worked for a large part of your careers now at culturally specific social or community-based organizations, that is, those which advocate and seek to represent AAPI communities, whether it's SON, A3P Con, CABA, Advancing Justice. Connie, you in particular have previously talked about why you were drawn to such organizations. You had said, I'm not going to read the entire quote, but you had said, because no matter how hard I or my organizations try to reach more ANHPI clients by hiring bilingual staff, promoting our work with ethnic media, or connecting to culturally specific organizations, I discovered that HPI clients simply weren't comfortable coming to a dominant organization that was not culturally tailored to serve their specific needs. So Connie, I'll start with you. Can you expand upon this epiphany that you had? And Manju, can you also talk about whether you had a similar reason for working at organizations like SAN and AP3Con?
Yeah. So, when you look at organizations like my previous one, which is Korean American Family Services or KFAM, we were providing a lot of social services that are sort of stigmatized in the Korean American community. We provided mental health, domestic violence, and child welfare services. And it's interesting because organizations like KFAM or South Asian Network that Manju worked at, these organizations emerged because our community members were not being served. They were not comfortable going to mainstream organizations or government agencies asking for help. And so our communities built their own support network and their own organizations. And so at KFAM, what I learned, because our clients were more than 90% for our mental health and domestic violence clients, more than 90% limited English proficient Korean immigrants. They were the ones who would otherwise fall through the radar because they don't speak the language, but also because culturally it is hard to talk about these issues, especially to somebody who doesn't look like you, who doesn't talk like you, and doesn't really connect with you. And that, even calling and having somebody answer the phone in their native tongue was one less barrier. It was one more comfortable thing that they could rely on. So, for me, I realized it became very clear at KFAM how important culturally specific organizations were. And if you're trying to get, the low-hanging fruit, folks who are really well acculturated, speak English well, feel very comfortable in American culture, yes, mainstream organizations can do that. But if you're really trying to target the marginalized community members, the ones who are really hard to reach, and really, in fact, the ones who need the services the most, you really do need to rely on those grassroots, culturally specific organizations. I mean, like right now, what we're seeing with anti-Asian hate, we do know from the wonderful publications and reports that Manju's group, Stop AAPI Hate, gives, that women of Asian descent are targeted 2 to 3 times more than men in this pandemic. And when I've spoken to Asian female victims of hate, I hear so many of those barriers. It's not just the language. It's not just the culture. It's that they're afraid of not being believed or being accused of being making it up. They're ashamed and embarrassed and feel stigmatized. And their family members sometimes say to them, why would you talk about this and bring shame and embarrassment to yourself and therefore to our family by talking about it? These are those cultural nuances and things that Asians experience, especially marginalized groups like Asian women, that it's harder at a mainstream non-API organization to really understand that and feel like that the organization can understand it for victims in quite the same way.
And what I would just add to the really important points that Connie made is that too often, in our history, mainstream organizations actually have, in one way or another, refused service to our community members. So, for example, one of our partner organizations, Asian Pacific Community Fund, came into existence because United Way was not making grants and providing services to non-white communities. They just simply were not giving money at all to any organization or to community members as a whole that were not white. And so we need to remember too that so often that these mainstream organizations, they're not neutral. They have their own agendas. They have their own perspectives in terms of the work. And so they often miss the nuances that are important in serving our communities. For example, making sure that services are available in language, making sure that they understand the cultural components. Connie pointed to issues around, domestic violence. And, I can tell you, for example, that often with mainstream organizations, there's an attitude or perspective that women want always in all circumstances to leave their batterers. And actually in the AAPI community, we know that that's not necessarily the case, that actually that brings harm to women, often greater harm than what they experience staying within the home. So it's having those understandings and really being open to what our community's experiences are and how those are different than white mainstream communities.
I think that's a great point. And Manju, I had read that, for example, Stop AAPI Hate in part was created because a few of you had gone and approached the California Attorney General's office to see if there could be a more concerted effort on the part of the government to track this growing anti-Asian hate incidents. And the answer was no, because they felt like what was already existing was enough. And so all of you went out and decided to just create Stop AAPI Hate. So it sounds like from what both of you are saying, a lot of these culturally specific organizations obviously are necessary, and it fills a much needed gap because of many of the issues that both of you talked about. So again, thank you both for explaining that to the viewers. So I want to now turn to yet another parallel before we start talking a little bit more about some observations about the legal profession. Both of you moved away from a pure lawyer's role to an executive director, CEO role, which requires you essentially to be a jack of all trades, right? A lawyer, policy advocate, community organizer, social media, public relations specialist. I'm sure I'm missing some many other roles. Can each of you speak about what prompted this trajectory? Was it an intentional trajectory? And what attracts you to this hybrid role?
Well, I can start. I think for me, I was on the board of South Asian Network prior to applying to be the executive director. And even before that, I was a volunteer for their legal clinics. And so I think the decision was sort of twofold. One was, as Connie mentioned, really wanting to serve the needs of my community and bring my background, my expertise to bear to help members of my specific community. So it was being, in some ways, that code switcher, understanding the law and then understanding my community and being able to merge the two in terms of where I was able to bring my skill set. The other is, though, also the leadership opportunities. And, I've seen that for myself as well in my role now at AppCon, is to be able to ascend to a role as executive director within a culturally specific organization where I may not be seen in the same way at a more mainstream organization. So it's not to say that I didn't get wonderful opportunities in my prior roles at National Health Law Program or the civil rights law firm I was at. I certainly did, but it was quite another step to get into a position of such visibility and really taking on the helm of leadership, which I think was essentially a little bit easier or more accessible, going back to the community and serving in that role.
So for me, coming out of law school, I ended up practicing as a civil rights attorney for 7 years at the ACLU in Chicago and the Housing Rights Center in LA. And after 7 years, what I realized were two things. One was that I didn't really want to be a litigator anymore. I didn't love the adversarial process, although I did love the issues and the causes. And then the second thing I realized, like Manju, is that I really had a thirst to want to work in my own community. And I wanted to be working to serve the API community because at my previous organizations, despite strong efforts at hiring bilingual staff and outreaching, they just weren't able to penetrate API immigrant communities. So I made the decision. I wanted to stay a nonprofit. I wanted to work at a culturally specific one. But I wanted to be in more of an administrative role. And when the opportunity came to take on the executive role at KFAM, I mean, honestly, I don't know what the board was thinking. I had never had a management role. I'd never handled a budget. I'd never written a grant. I didn't know anything about HR. But they took a leap of faith and they hired me. And for me, there was a moment where I thought, what am I doing taking this role that I'm so unqualified for? I also had never worked in domestic violence or mental health. Although my mother is a child psychiatrist, I knew a little bit about it, but I wasn't a practitioner. And my Korean wasn't that good. And so I was thinking, why would they hire me? Maybe this is wrong. But I knew inherently that my long-term professional goal was to become the executive director of a nonprofit. As an administrator, that's kind of your final stop. And so I felt like I couldn't turn down this opportunity. So, I jumped into it. And I will say the first few years were pretty hard. I had no idea what I was doing. And I was wearing multiple hats. We were a very small, grassroots organization with only 12 staff. And, in addition to the roles you mentioned, Carol, I still remember I was the U-Haul driver because we were doing a fundraising event. And I need to pick up the chairs and the tables to take over to the venue. And, I always washed our tablecloths after our event. So that was my role too. But it really was one of those things. Had I not taken that leap of faith and made that jump, I don't know where I would be today, but that really was what it took.
So I appreciate both of you, and Connie, I shorted you of a couple of roles there. So Manju, you had just previously talked a little bit about this, but I kind of want to drill down a little bit because I think it's a very important topic. You had previously talked about, and I think you just touched upon a little bit, about your belief that public interest enabled you to climb the leadership ladder much faster. I think you previously pointed out in other interviews that you got into management, I believe at the Office of Civil Rights Monitor in your mid-20s, for example. And you've previously noted your ability to attain different leadership roles that you think that you might not have gotten in a corporate law setting like a law firm. And so I wanted to sort of throw that both out to you as more generic a question. What is it about the public interest sector that seems to allow for women and women of color to attain the leadership roles that they deserve? It's not like you're being handed it to it, but why are they more receptive to seeing the merit in women that maybe at a law firm that they don't? So for example, in answering that, if you could also comment about what you think is holding back women and people of color in the profession, specifically at law firms where, everybody knows there's a very small fraction of women of color, people of color making it to partner level, getting on executive committees and firm leadership roles.
Well, I think, what I would say first off is that at the core of most of these public interest organizations is racial equity, gender equity. And so, we certainly would hope that in terms of their own leadership development, that they seek out individuals who, are individuals of color and women in those roles. And I think a lot of times you see that versus the corporate sector. And there's not the same sort of bottom line in terms of, how much business are you bringing in? What are the dollars you're bringing in, right? Because you don't do that at a public interest firm or organization. And so I think that's often, just knowing that my husband is a partner at a law firm, that's one of the challenges for attorneys like him and other attorneys of color, is to know that it becomes harder to bring in the dollars because of essentially how our capitalist systems work. What I would say too, though, is, I want to give a lot of credit to the public interest. I mean, in my own experience, one thing I was able to do as well is I was able to have children and take time off while also climbing the ladder. And that often is a barrier within a firm setting because you need to clock a number of hours. And that's hard to do when you're trying to manage childcare or even just take care of yourself. I mean, I literally was at National Health Law Program. I remember the opposing attorney who was representing a corporation on some litigation took 2 days off after giving birth because she had to write this appellate brief. There was never that kind of expectation on me, and I think not on other attorneys. In fact, I was able to not only take off, sort of the requisite 3 months for the first child, I took off 6 months for my second child. And then after that went to a less than full-time schedule for a number of years and still became a senior attorney at National Health Law Program. I think without that, my career would have been very different, and they're being able to see that my work was still of high level, despite the fact that I wasn't giving the exact same number of hours.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I mean, I do think in the nonprofit public interest sector, your opportunities to advance are accelerated compared to law firms. And so, just being at a public interest place, I got opportunities that I can't imagine in a law firm you would ever get. I was a summer law clerk in my second year in San Francisco. And also because I was always gravitated towards impact litigation, public interest places, I got to research for a Supreme Court case when I was a second year law student. And sit in and participate in moot discussions and oral argument practices. I argued before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals when I was, I think, 26. I handled depositions, and I had and got to go in negotiations for for my clients at a very young age because I was the lead counsel. There weren't any other attorneys there. So it was my case. I do it, right? It's a little different in firms where when, there's the billing and the stakes are high and you have a team of 12 attorneys, you're not going to get those same opportunities, I think, to do those kinds of things. And I would add that I think what Manju said about for women who are trying to have families, that is also a huge difference. I have a lot of friends from law school who ended up leaving the firm life before they made partner, because in those 7 or 8 years it takes to become a partner, now they're in their mid 30s and they want to have families, and they didn't feel like they could do it if they stayed in the law firm. So they left. So I think that it does allow for a more balanced lifestyle, and nonprofits have a higher rate of having leaders or executive directors who are women. And I do think having women executive directors does create a different culture sometimes and different expectations of that work-life balance that I think also helped.
So I'm going to follow up on that with this question to both of you, which is there such a thing as work-life balance? Even in the public interest sector, I would imagine both of you, with all of the work that you do with your organizations, but also especially during the pandemic, all the speaking engagements, all the extra advocacy that you are doing, is work-life balance? Is that a real thing? And is it possible? Or is it a goal that is hard to attain, and maybe where women are a little bit setting themselves up thinking there is such a goal that can be had?
I mean, I can answer quickly and say, as executive director, no. There's no balance whatsoever. And knowing and seeing that Connie and I are on calls, early morning, we're in meetings, late afternoon, evening. During the pandemic, sometimes it's very often actually that I'm working till 2 a.m. Luckily, I'm a night owl, so that works to my benefit to have those later hours. But I think that earlier in my career, there was still that availability to have balance. And I think partly because I worked 70% for, I would say, at least 4 or 5 years, that I was able to do that. So, but you know, I also think things have changed just with expectations, right? Now, if you're 1 minute late to a Zoom meeting, people are calling you and saying, "Where are you?" Right? That didn't happen when we were in person. I think, you know, because of text and Slack and all of these different avenues, there are greater expectations to be available and to then work more. So there are a number of different components and why there's not as much work-life balance. But I think, again, if you're at a more junior level, you can achieve that more readily than you can when you're in senior management.
Yeah, you know, I have to echo what Manju said. There is no work-life balance. I think, you know, also as a professional working mom, I have never met a working mom who doesn't feel guilt all the time, that they're not giving enough to work when they're with their family, and they're not giving enough to their family when they're at work. And when I speak to my mentor, who has been a corporate executive and now retired and did all this, I asked, does it ever get better? And her answer was, no, you just learn to live with the guilt better, and you just accept it better. And so I agree. I mean, I'm sure Manju and I were working like 100-hour weeks, you know, in May or after the Atlanta shootings. Things were hot and heavy for us. And what that meant was just sacrificing sleep. And sometimes it meant my kids didn't see me for an entire day or two. Even though I was in the same house as them, because we were all on Zoom together. But I literally would not leave my office. And I think you just learn, though, how to deal with it. And I do think that one thing that has helped is that I am more sensitive to it, though. And I try to create some culture in my office where we try to institute some boundaries. So one thing that I realized when I started my new job was that I would get text messages and emails at 7 or 8 p.m. asking, hey, can you review this press release? We have to send it out tomorrow, or can you look at that? And I ended up sending an email to all my staff, and I told them, between the hours of 6 to 9, I am usually at dinner with my family, and I am getting my kids ready for bed, and I'm tucking them in. If you try to contact me during those times, I will not be available. If it's a true emergency, call me. But otherwise, you won't see me looking at my text or my cell phone, because I don't allow cell phones at the dinner table. And, you know, I've created those kinds of expectations and boundaries with my staff. And in doing so, they feel the freedom to have some boundaries themselves that I don't think necessarily was part of the culture of our organization in the past, including things like vacation time. I say, when you're on vacation, you are on vacation. So it has, I think there is some creation of those boundaries that I'm trying to put up. And so I do try to model that a little bit myself, but I do find it's always an uphill battle.
So my next question is something that Connie, you had briefly touched upon, which is imposter syndrome. It's something that I think a lot of women feel. You had one of your prior answers talked about when you first became the director of KFAM, and you had said, you know, what are they thinking? I'm not equipped to doing this. I want to talk, hear both of your thoughts about imposter syndrome. Is that still an affliction that's mostly, women feel? And if so, how do we combat that? How do we get around it?
Yeah, I think I've learned as I've gotten older that I have to recognize women in general tend to feel like they are not as qualified, right, as men for different positions. That's why we don't often apply for the positions that are a harder reach for us. We don't ask for the same salaries as men do. And so I've made a conscious effort to recognize that. And when I feel like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough, or I'm faking it, I'm not the right person, I think to myself, is part of that really because of that kind of gendered social norms and construct that has sort of been, that I'm sort of falling prey to. And so I try to give myself more credit than I did when I was younger. Sometimes I still feel like I'm in a room and maybe I'm not the right person there, but typically I understand, if I'm less experienced than other people, that I'm usually also younger than some of my other colleagues in that room, and that I'm offering a perspective. Or if I'm in a room full of a bunch of older white men and I come in there, that I am adding a unique value, and being there is actually a contribution and a benefit to them all, even if I'm not as well versed maybe in the subject matter area, that my life experience and who I am is an added value to that space. And so I'm trying to get over it a little bit more, and I think that helps. And I think I would say women in general, we need to give ourselves more credit than we do. And so we just need to show up in spaces and own it, that we are there. There was a reason we were asked to be in that room, or the reason why we are there, and just we have value for that.
I couldn't agree more with what Connie has said. And, just wanted to add too that, think about all of the places and spaces we're in, right? Why is it that we feel imposter syndrome? Because when we look at the photos in the state capitol or in the boardrooms, when we look at, I tell my students at UCLA, look at who all the buildings are named after, right? When you think of leaders for API Heritage Month or Black History Month, who do they talk about? They're all of these ways in which women's leadership has never been recognized. And so it's not a surprise then that we feel like imposters, because society is telling us that we are, right? That it is not our natural place to be leaders. In fact, there was a park that I took my kids to a number of years ago that was named after a woman. I think that's the only park I've ever seen named after a woman, which is the Christine Reed Park in Santa Monica. There's not any, right? And so when we begin to interrogate the way that everything around us is shaped and molded, we see why we get these messages, right? It's not only that, it's essentially that we're seeing what is reality. And, I agree too with what Connie said in terms of learning to take up space, not acknowledging or allowing for being interrupted in different settings. And, I'll tell you a funny story. A number of years ago, when my husband and I met and we started dating, I was really surprised by his level of confidence. We were both in law school. And I thought to myself, he's not actually smarter than me. If he can walk around the world with this level of confidence, why can't I? So I essentially said, look, he's clownish half the time, right? And yet he can be arrogant and again, confident. So, I think it was sort of a lesson just from that, is like seeing men around me and knowing that I was fully capable and just as smart as they were. And why not walk around with that same level and air of confidence and grace?
Thank you both for your thoughts on that. So both of you obviously are women of color, specifically women of AAPI descent. And as we know, the intersectional discrimination and hate has often plagued women of AAPI descent over the years. Obviously, as Connie pointed out, for example, in the Atlanta shootings, another example would be the Page Act of 1875. I think one of the very few, if not the only, federal legislation aimed at Asian women. And the reason it was because they were seen as a sexual threat. I also want to throw out a quote from Audre Lorde that said where she says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." Can you describe, and this is really the heart of what I want to talk about today, can you describe how intersectional discrimination has played out in the workplace, in your lives, for you or anybody else with whom you've come across? Put another way, can you describe any incidents of bias or any particular hurdles you have encountered in your legal careers that you believe are the result of being a woman? And also just throw out and make it even harder, these questions. Does it get worse for a woman of color?
Well, I can start. The Atlanta shooting that you mentioned, Carol, is a prime example of this, where we see that those who were targeted for their race because they're Asian American, and then targeted for their gender and the roles they played in terms of the workplace, right? So that they were potentially, as women of color and as immigrant women, limited in terms of the venues in which they were allowed to work, where they would be hired, and those were in the massage parlors. And so they were just simply trying to feed their families, earn a living. And then what happened is this man comes and kills them essentially because of his own moral depravity, his own mental issues, and seeing them really and their demise as a way to essentially uplift him, right? Because he said he had a sexual addiction and he was relieving himself of it by destroying the lives of these women and their families. So I think that, too often we've seen that at Stop AAPI Hate. 65% of the incidents reported to us come from women. And we see, even less severe examples where sometimes women are harassed on the street or even asked out on a date. And when they say no, and they rebuff those essentially invitations to go out or, engage in a relationship or engage in sex, they're then told, go back to your country, or racial epithets are hurled at them. And so we see, we know from the Me Too movement that sexual harassment really is ubiquitous in the US. 80% of women have experienced it at some form in their lives. And then now with what's happening to AAPI women, we see that racialized component being added. So there's no question. And I think that quote that you shared is so important because it is, we have different parts of our lives that we live, and people perceive us for all of those parts, not just one single one versus another.
For me, when I think of a couple personal experiences where being an Asian woman, I think had an impact. One was I was representing a client when I was practicing as an attorney who was an older man. And when I would speak to him at one of our meetings, he kept calling me honey and dear. And I finally told him very firmly, you can call me Connie or Miss Chung, which was my maiden name. And then, he stopped doing that. But I wonder how many male attorneys, get that pulled on them. And another one was my first, the first time I had to settle a case when I was at the Housing Rights Center. I was going against a partner at a major law firm who was an older white man. And as soon as he saw me enter the room, he said, "Oh, is your boss coming into the meeting?" Who was an older man. And I said to him, I said, "No, it's me." And he looked at me and you could tell he was not happy. And whether that was because I was young or whether it was because I was a woman, or because I was Asian, I don't know, but I suspect it was all three. And what I've seen is in my work now, You mentioned, Carol, I was one of the co-chairs when we founded the California Culturally Responsive Domestic Violence Network. And that network was founded by a cohort of domestic violence organizations who work with communities of color, particularly because we saw that in the domestic violence field, it had been, the leadership and the messaging had been dominated by white women, and that communities of color were being left out. So we had to fight for that as people of color. And then now with the rise in anti-Asian hate, I make sure at every single presentation I am in to talk about how Asian women are disproportionately impacted and the additional barriers Asian women have to overcoming and reporting hate. Because if I don't say it, it often gets left out. And so this intersection means that in gender-based violence spaces, I'm pushing for the needs of API and other women of color, and that in the Asian and race space, that I'm pushing to make sure we uplift the stories of women, and I see it kind of a constant struggle to make sure they're included.
Thank you both for that. So I want to get through a few more questions before we let you both go back to the important work that you're doing. Speaking of which, so the last few years obviously have been difficult for the entire world and the United States, even before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hits and their anti-Asian hate seems to explode into violence, assaults, etc. First, I want to ask how both of you have been for the last year and a half. Obviously, very important work, but I'm sure emotionally draining for you. I wonder if the work that you've done, especially over the last year and a half during the pandemic, and some of the broader dynamics that have occurred, both in terms of the anti-Asian hate rising, but also the reckoning in terms of systemic and institutional racism. Does that make you optimistic in terms of your worldview on the world, for the world and society, as well as for the legal profession?
I'll jump in. Thank you for asking how we're doing. It's not a question. It's a question that I get asked sometimes, but I do wish I would get asked it more. I will say that it's been challenging. It's been challenging for all, I think, Asian Americans during this time. It's emotionally so traumatic to see what's been happening to our community, and people are scared and we're angry. But because we're also working in it, we don't have the opportunity to really process it and have that space to sit back and live with those feelings and take the break that we need. Instead, we are busier than ever charging ahead to try to address it. So I have been very sensitive to how that is for my staff to be working in this space and having to work so hard. When I'm saying that, companies, you need to give a little bit of space to your Asian, colleagues and coworkers, but not being able to really do that for my own staff as well. I've shared, Carol, in other spaces that I joined Advancing Justice LA last August because during the pandemic, we saw the rise in anti-Asian hate. And then we also saw soon thereafter the murder of George Floyd that led through the Black Lives Matter movement, a reckoning in our society around systemic racism and anti-Blackness that I'd never seen, not when I was starting up as a civil rights attorney. And so for me, it's been very validating and gratifying to be able to work in this space and be at Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA during this pivotal time. We do have a pretty robust body of work now that we're able to address it. And I do find it gratifying because, I do talk about my work with my family and my kids, and my kids are now more sensitized towards racial injustice and wanting to promote social justice. My 8-year-old, anytime she sees a Black Lives Matter poster, she points it out to me. Or when at school for API Heritage Month, there was chalkboard art that mentioned it, she showed that to me. And so I appreciate that my kids have a better understanding than certainly I did growing up. And I do hope that that will continue to grow, not just for them, but for all of our kids through more things like Asian American curriculum and things like that. So I'm hopeful that this will continue to be the start of a larger movement. It's not going to be a flash in the pan moment, and then we're going to forget about it until the next time our community gets targeted. And trying to be part of that solution to figure out how to do that, how to build this racial solidarity we need in order to take the movement there. It's an exciting place to be.
So to piggyback on that, I mean, I would say that, it has been really important to see attention on issues of concern for our communities, because too often we've been invisibilized. And there hasn't been that level of attention or concern, really. I've said to many folks that the House Judiciary Committee hearing that I was part of was the first one in 30 years that addressed any issue impacting our communities. And that's just unacceptable. It's unconscionable. And so we've got to, I think we are working as hard as we can to make sure that doesn't happen again, right? Our communities need resources. We need to be able to uplift the experiences that Asian American women, men, youth, seniors are experiencing right now. And it has absolutely been traumatic. What I would add to that in terms of, what we're trying to uplift is also debunking the model minority myth. And I think by folks seeing that, hopefully, that they understand we're not a monolith, that we have challenges, we have struggles like other communities, I think brings out our full humanity, but also, again, brings to our communities what they need, which is so critical. And lastly, what I want to say in terms of whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, I'll start with the pessimistic side, which is that unfortunately, over the last several years, we've seen really the opening of the dam of white supremacy, and a president that allowed it, encouraged it. And now, unfortunately, I mean, he's not the only one, which is to say that state and federal leaders won't even condemn the insurrection. They won't condemn racism against our communities. So we don't even have that sort of foundational understanding anymore that hate is wrong. And part of that is, I think, what we see is a rising authoritarianism. You see state after state, suppressing the vote of people of color, being willing to, in fact, nullify elections. That's actually a pretty scary state that we're in. I'm not sure that we were a democracy essentially to begin with. And even, more and more we're moving into an authoritarian regime. What I would say that is positive is that people are being activated, especially in our communities. Many of them haven't had that opportunity before. Certainly they were concerned with raising families, putting food on the table, but to see, grandmothers and grandfathers, ammas and appas, out there in full force, at rallies, really finding their voice for the first time. I think that's going to be important, not only in terms of stopping AAPI hate, but really moving our country to that aspiration of what America can be, a true democracy that's inclusive, that allows each of us to really reach our fullest potential.
Thank you both so much for your thoughts. I am going to end this because I know we're running out of time. I could literally talk to both of you for days on end, but for 60 seconds each of you, what advice, guidance would you give to the viewers of this installment today? Going from a young woman starting out, looking to go into the law, to somebody who might be a little bit more towards the tail end of her career or otherwise feeling a little stuck. What are your parting sort of advice and guidance to them, and anything else you want our viewers to know in about 60 seconds for each of you?
Well, I would say, to young women out there, you are smart, you are capable, you have all the talents and skills that you need to pursue the law, to move up the ranks, to pursue leadership opportunities. You will have to work hard. You will likely have to work harder than any man that you know for those positions. And you are strong, you're resilient, you come from a lineage of strong, resourceful, brilliant women, much like Connie and I do, and we've spoken about today, and that you should seek out support from your partners, from your friends, your colleagues. They're there to support you, many, if not all of them. And I want to just finally give a shout out to my own family, my 2 daughters and my husband, who have supported me, especially during the pandemic, whether it's bringing me coffee in the morning, or giving me just this quiet space to be with you all, I think is such a treasure. And want to just say that, young women, you can absolutely do it. And I can't wait to see what the next generation brings.
What I would say is also to the young women out there, and really all women, go for it. Take the risks, take the challenges and opportunities that come to you. Whether you feel that you are equipped or well enough to do it, I will tell you that I am certainly not the smartest person in the room. I'm not the smartest person out of my 3 siblings. They're far more talented people out there, but I was willing to take those risks, and I was willing to work damn hard to just get through it. And I think that has gotten me quite far. And I think women need to push themselves to take those risks that men, I think, take inherently a little bit more easily. And then the second thing I would say is, in this moment, we are living in a time that is historical. We know that what we are going through in the last year under this pandemic will be in our history books. And our kids and our grandkids and future generations will be reading about it, learning about it, and they will ask us all, what was it like to be living through this period? And so I would ask you to reflect about what you are going to be able to say. What was your contribution to this moment? And particularly if you can help our API community, think about what you can do, whether it's donating to an organization, volunteering, attending bystander intervention training to learn how you can support APIs, whatever it may be. You have this moment in history, and I hope you use it to do something to promote social justice.
Connie Chung and Manju Kulkarni, thank you so much for your time today, and more importantly, for your work. You're an inspiration to me, and I'm sure to all of our viewers today. So thank you both very much.
Thank you
for having me.